Great. So first of all, thank you for joining us for another craft conversation. So we're here today with Susan Furneaux. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, so I am Susan Furneaux. I am a textile artist and educator at the College of the North Atlantic right now.
So we're going to be talking today a little bit about natural fibers. So how do you want to start off today?
So I've worked with natural fibers my whole life. Early in my career, somebody called me a fabric snob because I only worked with natural fibers. For me, it's not only about, at the time, like, yes, it was important to use natural fibers, but it was also about how the fibers worked. They do what I want them to do. They have memory, so if I place them a certain way, it will stay. The synthetic fibers just don't work that way. And they don't feel nice. They're not nice to work with. The colors are garish. Even before I started using natural dyes, I found that the colors of the synthetic fabrics were just awful. And they didn't do what I wanted them to do. And I learned that very early on because I've been sewing since I was a child. It's not only about oh my, we almost use natural fibers. It's also about the way the material behaves, right? And now, yes, we should all be using natural fibers. We know that we should have done that from the get-go. Then I started using natural dye. I took the program at the College of the North Atlantic and I learned dyeing techniques. I was the dye technician and I was introduced to natural dyes during that time, and then I made the complete switch over. So now in my practice, I don't use natural dyes that much anymore. I do a little for threads or maybe a little bit of splash of color because I really like red. For the most part, I'm using the colors of the materials as they exist. Because I found what I was doing was I was replicating the color that I really loved. And I said, why am I doing that? Why don't I just use that material?
When we first met, we were talking a lot about wool, and I feel like I've heard your name come up a lot, talking about like natural dyeing and stuff like that. But then I've seen a little bit of a shift in your career, that going more towards non-dyeing. So yeah, and I still do. Like, I love the color of Japanese indigo, so I still grow that and dye wool for my own use. But in my work, I really love the natural color, and I get lost in it. And for me, it was, why am I trying to replicate it? You know, why can't I just use it? And I made that big shift during COVID when I was just, what am I going to do now, And it kind of stuck with me, and I'm really happy that, it did. Yeah, so that's, I do use some color. These are things that I find, the bits of rope on the beach and things like that. Then I use them as stitching material, it just gives that little bit of change and difference. So like this kind of thing here. Yeah. It's what I use to hold it all together. And so it's nice, and I really like that color too. So it's really lovely. Yeah. So this is a piece of the blue. Is a piece of found cord. Is that what it is?
It's fishing rope that's used, and it was just on the beach. So I take the rope apart once I get it and use it for stitching or weaving or whatever.
Like how does dyeing a wool and then using that versus like using the actual color from the piece itself, how does that compare?
It's a little bit more challenging, obviously, and a little bit more time consuming. I mean, my work was time consuming enough as it was, but now it's even more time consuming because a lot of my processes involve something like this. So this is nettle fiber that I stripped last year off the nettles. It's the bark. You wear leather gloves and you just rub your hands up and down, right, on the nettle, and then you break it when it gets to a certain point, and you can peel it's a bast fiber, and it has always been used as a bast fiber. Like, a lot of people think that this stuff is new stuff, but it's not. I mean, people have been doing this for ages, right? Yeah. So then when it gets to this stage, you ret it, which means rot it out on the ground, and then you can spin it. Okay. And it behaves very much like a linen. Okay. Right? And it's actually quite strong and quite lovely as fiber if you really want to get into making it really refined and beautiful, like good quality linen. But I mean, I can't go there. I just don't have enough time, and this is fine. I make thread out of things. So this thread here is made with spruce bark. So I'm using this for some of my work right now, and you can see it. So to get the bark to this point where I can actually make thread with it, it takes a while. Here it is here. This is what I make the thread with. I actually dye the fish skins with it first. So these are some cod skins that have been dyed in the spruce with bark tanning. And then after I finish with the fish skins, then I can strip it down to make things like baskets or, you know, weave it fairly big. And then when it gets down and down from thread size, then I actually can make paper with it. To get it to the point where you can make paper and make thread is about a 2-year retting process, right?
Wow, yeah, okay.
It's really beautiful because it smells so lovely. So I was just going to show you some cordage because that's sort of the foundation of, you know, all textiles is thread. So this is corn husk, and there's lots of YouTube videos out there, but I find the corn husk is nice and it's immediate. You know, you don't have to do anything but dry it out and then rehydrate it. And I mean, there's lots of it around. I mean, you can just go to the grocery store and there's a big bin of corn husk underneath because people husk their corn before they take it home. All you do is you take a piece this long. I haven't done it when it's still green, but you could probably still do it when it's green. Fold it in half so that one side is a little longer than the other. That's so that when you have a join, they're not in the same place. And you just twist away from you and then bring it over. Twist away from you and bring it over. And you just keep pinching. So twist away and bring it over. Twist away and bring it over. I'm going to grab another little piece. Put this in. I'm not really caring about evenness in this. So twist away. Bring it over. And I don't mind, as I say, I'm not worried about the evenness. I'm not worried about, you know, the variation in this one in the width of the cord. Now, this is the original way of making cord. They have found this in, all kinds of graves in Europe. And, you know, it would have taken a very long time. But prior to the spinning wheel, this was it. So obviously, I don't do this to make garments or anything. I just bring in another piece. But there are people who have made entire garments recreated them, Stone Age garments with nettle, using this process. But
so if you have a small amount of it then, because you said you don't make it in big amounts, then what do you usually use it for?
Embroidery.
Ah,
right.
yes.
So, you know, I can outline areas, couch it down. I don't. The small spruce that I have there, that is thread to actually join two pieces together of fabric. The spruce is quite strong, and the nettle is quite strong because the fibers are long. If your fibers are long, you will get a strong cord. The cordage for the dandelion is really not that strong, but quite lovely. So you can't pass it through the fabric, but you can certainly make a basket or couch it down onto a ground.
So I know one of the things that I saw when I was looking into your work too is kind of the extent to which things are cyclical. So like looking at the seasons, for example, or
the seasons do play a big part, and I've always kind of worked that way, just because it made sense. And I mean, it's traditional here in Newfoundland and Labrador to work with the seasons. You know, you just get so busy, right?
Yeah.
And so in the summer, you're growing things, and then in the fall, you're harvesting plants and saving them, or you're dying, because some things you can't save, you have to use right away. And then in the winter, you know, you're inside embroidering or making or whatever. Now that I want to be outside and I'm making smaller things, I can actually work outside, so that's great. But it does follow cycles, and you know, it's the nature of the materials and the fact that, you know, you have to collect spruce bark in the spring, and you have to grow the indigo in the summer. And
I was one of the things I was really curious about that I wanted to ask is like, is there anything that you collect in the winter? Like, are there any particular materials that are best for the winter or that?
No, I'll tell you what I like in the winter. I really like the dried grasses and the inspiration of the shapes of seed pods and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite time to be in the woods is when the snow goes in the winter, because it's the colors, that ash gray with the big splash of red from the dogwood and those are the colors. That's the palette that really excites me. So I find that the winter I'm stitching or I'm making, But that is where the inspiration, the palette comes from, is that time, like as soon as the snow goes and it's gray and the greens obviously, but and the sky even. Yeah.
And it must be awesome to have kind of that stitching time in the winter, but also like that kind of overlapping with the time when you're really excited by that palette.
Yeah. And the seed pods, the form of seed pods to me is just, as they're spent, there's a piece here with the dandelion heads on them, but there's no seeds left. Like that's really, there's a lot of plants out there that have really interesting forms when all the seeds have gone on and the dead plant is still there. Yeah.
Which is so cool, because I think that's one of the, I mean, typically I would imagine that's the part that gets ignored. That's the part that doesn't get brought into things, that people aren't maybe as immediately.
Even the grass, the grass is really exciting after it's just died and just standing there after the winter. Yeah.
So I'm just curious now, more generally, what draws you to the two-dimensional form? And like, do you know what it is in particular that draws you to like that two-dimensionality versus that three-dimensionality?
I'm trying to get into the three-dimensionality now with things, and I think it's because I don't like working with wire or anything hard like that. I just don't find it pleasant. I'm actually doing some kinds of trials now where I'm going to try using beeswax so that I can get that shape. I've done figures, like those dolls and things, so I know that shape and can do that no problem. But getting into more sort of abstract shapes is completely new for me. This is not really that abstract, obviously, so I'm starting small, but I'm looking forward to doing work with the beeswax. Even though it'll start off two-dimensional, I think that it will give me more room for play.
And I love how, it's so interesting to me that it's really that driven by that material, love for material, like what form and things.
Yeah,
really...
and I've always loved encaustic work. I also love artists who use bits of textiles in with acrylic paint, even though I'm not a big fan of acrylic paint myself. I haven't done a lot of work with it, but I mean, I think that I can kind of bring that kind of texture. I really love textures. As you can see by all the things here. So I think I can bring all that into a piece with beeswax. So I don't really make any big pieces anymore. It's just the physicality of it. And I find it's not only the physicality of it, I'm at a point where I don't want to be sitting down for long periods of time. And I find making smaller pieces that I can really focus in on is much more exciting to me, and I can move on. Yeah. Like my brain just wants to move to the next thing. Yeah. Once I get past this size, I'm there, let's go to something new now. For me, that's what the excitement is, right? It's the trying things. And I don't mind doing larger pieces if they're a bunch of different components, almost. Like, a quilt with kind of thing with all different kinds of squares kind of thing, but not traditional quilting or anything, but that kind of thing where it's a triptych or something like that, where you can explore different techniques, because for me it's all process. That's what it's all about, right?
Something I was curious about is part of what we're talking about, like finding antique textiles, and I think you mentioned also growing things and looking for things and foraging things. I was really curious, do these two processes kind of overlap to you? Because to me they both seem a little bit like it's that act of hunting and looking for what's already there in the world.
It does, and it overlaps that hunting and looking for what's there. A lot of them do come to me as gifts, and a lot of it is still connected to my memories growing up. There was always a lot of fancy linens around, or people were making fancy linens, or it was, doilies and those kinds of things. So it still connects to my childhood memories of all that, wonderful things that really did excite me and got me involved in this path, Yeah, it's the same kind of, connection with memory and comfort and,
Yeah, it's it reminds me of that very, I don't know, I always have very complicated emotions whenever I see this beautiful granny square quilts, or quilts rather, but blankets and stuff at the thrift store, for example, right? Because it's okay, someone has valued this enough that they think, we're not going to throw it out, but part of me is it's kind of sad that it made its way there too. So.
Yeah. And I think that, a lot of people now, when they go to thrift stores, are like yourself, and they value it. One time you could go and you could find lots of old blankets, wool blankets, and I mean, it's very hard to find a wool blanket out there now because people buy them up and make them into other things, which is great. That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah. I know I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because I remember seeing a lot of like those quilted jackets, for example, where people are finding like really, you know what I mean? Like you either find an old, like kind of vintage antique quilt, and they take that and they cut it up and they turn it into
I mean, I think that's important. I mean, I really do. You know, people are valuing the time and the effort that somebody put in there and making it something grander. You know, like there's a long tradition here in Newfoundland and Labrador about making quilts and selling them for the price of the materials. You know? And it's just awful. And, you know, it's kind of been one of my lifelong missions to get people to ask the price. If they don't value their work, other people are not going to value their work as well. So at least the people who are making these things and cutting up these things they really value what they have. And, you know, they're bringing it up to giving it a new life and
engaging with the past too, which is
engaging with the past,
recognizing what came before, and I think that kind of shines through as well, kind of bringing those techniques from the past into the present. Yeah,
I guess I could talk about my little shoes. These are ones I did for my residency. The residency I'm doing talks about impermanence. Now I do use a lot of really antique materials. So this is antique lace, handmade lace, but there's so much of this out there and everybody goes, oh, it's a shame to cut it up. But the museum doesn't want it. So in order to give it a new elevation and a new life, I think it's fine to cut it up. And these are another little piece of shoes that I did, and you can see the gold work here. And these are sheep's teeth. And they're made with paper, and the paper is actually all made with dandelion puff.
When you're making things out of dandelion, what is that like? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, that was sort of the first plant I ever worked with when I was a child. I really like dandelion. I think it's you know, obviously everybody loves the dandelions now, feed the bees, and eat the dandelion. I don't eat dandelion. I did, but once I start dying with something, I can't eat it anymore.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I don't eat dandelion, but I did when I was younger. And it's a beautiful flower. I always thought it was beautiful. And the smell of it, you know, like and we used to squish them on rocks and make paint and do all kinds of stuff. Last year, my neighbor actually went out and vacuumed his back garden for me because his wife said, get rid of all those dandelion puffs before they go to seed. And he went out with a shop vac and presented me with a box of dandelion puff. Amazing. It was a very great gift.
Yeah. I've never heard of vacuuming their garden before.
And I was like, what is this? When I opened up the box, I thought it was some kind of like sheepskin or something. Yes, this is the dandelion paper.
Yeah, so what goes into this? Is it just the dandelion fluff? Like what?
Just dandelion fluff, and there is a little tiny bit. I'd say it's probably 80% dandelion fluff and 20% abaca fiber, which is a plant, another kind of paper fiber.
And then you kind of got some of those larger pieces.
So what I do is I pull up the big piece of paper when I pull the paper, and then I take dandelion and lay it down, and then I take a smaller, thinner sheet, and then I put that on top, and it traps the dandelion pieces in there.
Yeah.
The house up there, that's made of dandelion, or just background fabric for other things. That over there, that's fireweed paper. I really like paper, and it comes from my time as a printer.
I think so much of going for that natural fiber is like kind of a consciousness of like the earth, but also too like when you create, like you want to set like a element of permanence to it too. So like how does that fall on the scales for you?
When I started this journey and I was doing embroideries that were, I guess, a lot of time spent on them. And I mean, there still is a lot of time in my work, but you know, to me, I didn't expect my work to be in galleries. I expected them to be in museums because that's where I sort of draw my inspiration, those textiles that are hundreds of years old. Yeah. So I tried to get that permanence, right? And I know with natural dyes, you can't have that permanence because anything in a museum before 1860 is done with natural dyes, right? So you still have that permanence of materials. So for me, it's really important to have that. When I'm using these materials and making shoes out of paper, it's still important to have that eye to permanence. And I know that, you know, a lot of people don't feel that way, but for me, like it's just in me. there's nothing I can do about it.
So one thing I was really interested in what you were saying earlier is how like the objects have memory. Can you expand on a little bit? Because I think that's really, really interesting.
So as you're working, like if you've worked with embroidery with cotton, for example, when you embroider with cotton and you hold it, like you can finger press it, and your fingers can hold it to a certain shape. And it's the same with silk even more so. If you're an embroiderer and you've worked with cotton and then you make that switch to silk embroidery threads, there's no way you are going back, you know? And it's the same with cotton fabric versus silk fabric. All those things, you put them where you want them, and you almost don't even have to pin it. Your fingers can work it, and your hands learn how the fiber works. This still has a memory. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to make cordage out of it if it didn't, because it is a natural fiber. But these are all cellulose fibers, so they behave like cotton. They don't have as much of a memory as, like, say, a silk would or a wool or that kind of thing. I have worked a lot with moose hair for wild kind of fibers. I did do some tufting. Now I'm doing more embroidery with the moose hair and weaving with the moose hair, and that's a little challenging. It doesn't really have much of a memory. It does, but it's hollow, so it does weird things, and it's nice though. It's really neat.
Okay, now I have to ask where you get moose hair from.
So my partner and myself, since I've been tanning hides, but he tans large hides. So we'd have hunters come and they'd throw hides over the fence. And if they didn't tell us and we'd be gone, they'd just sit there, right? So somebody did that in the winter, and then the snow came. Once the snow went away, the hide was no good for tanning anymore. But the hair came off in perfect organized pieces if I pulled it, which was great. So I sat there and I pulled all the moose hide and put it all with little hair elastics and washed it all out, so I have all this neatly organized moose hair.
So again, it's a very like experimental.
Yeah, it was great. It may never happen again. But I did get quite a lot. And, it's easy to get moose fur for tufting and things like that. But to get these long fibers to weave or to knit with or to spin is just... That was wow. Once I get a fiber, like I'll do a bunch of different things with it to experiment with it.
Let's talk about place for a second. So I think something I saw from you is that like place is a really important thing for you. So how does using these materials interact with that?
It is very about place because my work, even the theme of my work is about place, and it's not just Newfoundland. It's more closer than that. I guess it's more the Avalon Peninsula, where I grew up. When I grew up spending a lot of time outside, and I was really interested in, what the different flowers were, or what the berries were, and all that kind of thing. And so these are the things that I grew up with. Like when I'm working with alder, I remember things from my childhood, or when I'm in the woods, it just reminds me of things. I do collect some things if I'm traveling across the island, like cattails. I got some cattails because there's not a lot of cattails on the Avalon Peninsula where they're pristine and clean. So I do pick up some things, but for the most part, I keep it pretty specific to the Avalon, right? Or Bonavista. I do pick up some stuff from Bonavista. I have family out there who, were originally from there. That's where my grandmother was from. So I do have a little soft spot for that.
Yeah, so it's almost like bringing those places, like what is home to
you,
I guess.
Yeah.
How does that then translate into the final objects that you make?
Well, usually the themes are, very specific to this area or to me or personal things. So I think that using those materials just makes the making more intimate, and it makes it more, personal and more, to me, more of a meditation. I still bring in a lot of gold work techniques. So it's taking these simple things like moose hair and chicken bones and goose skulls and things like that, and bringing them to a place of reverence with the ecclesiastical materials, right? The gold and the metal work,
Yeah, let's expand on it a little bit, because I know you've mentioned a couple of times like kind of that ecclesiastical reverence, but in different format. So can you expound a little bit, tell us a little bit more about that?
Gold work, embroidery, is a technique that goes back to the 10th century. It is using gold and metal thread to embroider things that were traditionally done for the church. And they're still done for the church. The technique has kept going, and a lot of the times when the raids were going on in Northern Europe, that's what they were taking, was the ecclesiastical embroidery, because it was all covered in gold. So that's kind of where my work led, even though I didn't do a lot of, like none of it was subject mattered in the Anglican Church, but it was just very much based on that traditional look and feel. You know, using that technique to talk about nature, I think, you know, it said a lot about my spirituality and that kind of thing.